thank you all for being here for the reading. So I'm going to read a little from my recent novel, This Strange Eventful History, which covers a lot of ground, like in that sort of don't try this at home way. If I was teaching my students and I want to write something that spans 70 years and 5 continents, I'd say do not do that. But it does. And so I'm going to read a little from there. It starts in 1940, it ends in 2010, and there's sort of sections every decade, and I'm going to read from a section in the early 1950s. What you need to know, there's a family, the parents, Gaston and Lucien, and their children are Denise and Francois. And Francois is in America at this point, studying at Amherst College on a scholarship. And Denise is back home, and they live in Algiers. And in case you don't know this, Algeria was a French colony from 1830 to 1962. In 1954 was the beginning of essentially the War of Independence that led to independence in 1962. So 1953, there were already, certainly at the university where Denise is a law student, there were the beginnings of student, there were already student activists, and there was a lot of activism, although the FLN had not sort of launched their campaign. So there were at that point there were a lot of different factions in a sort of gamut of possibilities. And Denise, who's mostly concerned about what dress she'll wear for a party, is not really aware of any of these, of any of it. So she's at home, and Dad is out of town, and they live with somebody named Tata Jeanne, who's her mother's sister. And she goes into the kitchen. Denise goes into the kitchen. It's evening. The man on the radio was blathering about the upcoming elections, some speech that Soustelle had given or was going to give, the shifting poll numbers, the possible shape of the council. Without asking Maman, Denise turned it off. She'd found an unsuspected interest in Roman law, but she still couldn't stand politics, those boring fat men in suits with their greasy comb-overs, or the fierce young militants of the university rallying for Algerian independence. Your father will want to know the updates, but Maman didn't turn from the sink, where she stood peeling potatoes. Denise caught the glimmer of her mother's gray roots, a sign of age almost always carefully concealed. Un an de plus, un soin de plus, she always said. But Papa had been away 10 days, and she must have been saving the housekeeping money, putting off as long as possible the visit to the hairdresser. Denise felt suddenly emotional. It would be on account of the stockings and the lace and the gloves and the mask for her party. Maman was kindness itself, a lay saint, Papa always said. Will you top and tail the beans, dear? Maman turned and handed her the dented colander. She looked tired, the bags under her eyes more pronounced than usual. I wondered about baking apples for dessert, but we've only got 2. You and I could share one, maybe. And the other a little treat for Tata Jeanne? Sure, I'll pour the apples when I've done the beans. Do we have raisins then? A few, enough. Maybe a little calvados with the sugar. Maman and Papa often spoke fretfully behind her back about how little Tata Jeanne had to look forward to, how few pleasures she had. But Denise thought her invalid aunt, given her infirmities, led quite a nice life, warm and fed and well surrounded. She'd come to live with them when Denise was very small, before even Beirut, after her and Maman's oldest sister, long the headmistress of the Teachers' College for Girls in Constantine, had dropped dead in the bathtub only a few months after her retirement. That aunt, Faye, had been older by 8 years than Tata Jeanne, whom she took care of for so long, and Tata Jeanne in turn was 12 years older than Maman. Denise had come to understand that in addition to Marie-Thérèse, never mentioned, who came between Faye and Jeanne and who died in France before Denise was born, there had been miscarriages and dead babies in between the sisters, one a toddler even, diphtheria, just as she'd come to understand, Tata Jeanne's indiscretion, that even in her own generation there had been miscarriages, 3 before Francois, and a stillbirth after herself. By which time, Denise had calculated, Maman would have been frankly old, as she'd been 41 when Denise was born. But now, firmly in age, Maman, soon to be 61, was still caring for her older sister. As if Tata Jeanne were a child, Papa and Maman kept her from all the worries of the household and of their own health. Maman had confided to her friend Aline that Papa was in a state of nervous exhaustion. She'd lowered her voice in the living room, thinking that Denise in her bedroom would not hear. But Denise wasn't called elephant ears for nothing. And then Maman herself, all the tests in the last few months, the visits to the neurologist to try to figure out what was causing her malaise and whether or not they were linked to her terrible migraines. None of this could be revealed to Francois, her brother, at all costs. He was to be free to enjoy his American adventure. He'd earned that, they were all agreed, but he was better now, so much better. This too was how you took care of other people. Denise knew already, though she wasn't any good at it. You pretended that you were fine, that everything was fine. Maman's new medication seemed to be helping, at least a little, so that was something. When Denise wrote now to Francois, she felt less like a liar. But she must have put on 7 or 8 kilos, which Denise knew dismayed her. Maman always said that it was part of a wife's job to be desirable to her husband, and that meant, among other details like weekly visits to the hairdresser, not getting fat. Which is why, of course, it was a shame that Denise was fat to begin with. No man would ever look at her as long as she was fat, except perhaps Mehmet. Maybe in Turkey the ideas of beauty were different. That was why Selvier thought he could cut her dead the way he had. She chopped and tailed the beans, she cored the apples, she stirred the beef in its wine sauce on the stove. She was on the verge, she felt, of doing something about it. Her weight, that was. Not in time for the ball, obviously. The dress would be as it would be, but when the weather got a bit warmer. She couldn't stand being cold, and being hungry made her cold. She decided to stop eating lunch and maybe breakfast too. Now that she was so often out at the faculty of the university, Maman wouldn't know what she ate or didn't. Denise had recently taken up smoking, though her parents didn't yet know, and Maman surely would disapprove as she considered women who smoked fast. Anne-Marie was a smoker, so Denise's new habit was logical, and she loved it. The cigarette looked elegant between her fingers, lent her square hands a touch of glamour. It gave her something to focus on, to look forward to talk about, or better still, to bond her to strangers, a way of joining a group or striking up a conversation. It stopped time for a few minutes and opened a little window of possibility, flirtation even. It made her feel less anxious in herself and cooler in the world, and the burning in her throat soothed her and changed the way things tasted and quelled her endless appetite, especially for sweet things, which were her downfall. She loved pastries, croissants, pain au raisin, the chocolate cake Maman made for parties and served with crème anglaise, and she loved ice cream in summertime, even when it was cheap and tasted thin and dotted with little chips of ice. Still she loved it, biting into the bland, sweet, latticed cone, a little soggy where the ice cream had melted into it. And chocolate, she loved almost all chocolate. She didn't need to choose like some between milk or dark. She still recalled her first chocolate bar late in the war, a gift from an American soldier, spring of '44 probably. She would have been 10, almost 11, on the street when she was walking home from school with Josiane from 2 doors down. And the trio of Americans in uniform had stopped them. The girls were so nervous to hand them each a milk chocolate bar wrapped in foil. How it had melted on her tongue. She remembered the soldier's bristled buzz cut through which shone the slanted afternoon sun, and how his scalp itself shone in the angry red pattern of pustules across his cheek. It was well before her own struggle with acne, and she'd been repelled. But he'd winked at them and grinned, and she and Josiane had laughed when he said, "C'est bon, non?" Because in fact he said, "C'est bon," and it sounded so funny. Papa, when he found out, had been furious, of course, that the girls had taken gifts from strange men, flirtatious Americans. It occurred to her that Maman suggested that they share a baked apple, not only to be kind to Tata Jeanne, but to reduce the amount of sweet for both mother and daughter without depriving themselves altogether. When the weather grew warmer, even just a little, she would renounce sweet things as well as lunch. Smoking could fill the gaps, but not tonight. And then after dinner, she goes to write to her brother to tell him what's up. But it's a little complicated because what do you tell and what do you not? She can't tell about her parents. So she said she decides that there are things she will tell him. First, though, the strange incident on Friday last. If she was going to keep secrets from Francois about Maman and Papa and their worries, then surely she might in exchange share with him what she had determined to keep secret from them. Late morning on Friday, she and Marie-Josée and Anne-Marie had just come out of Boulot's lecture. A good day for him. He'd been quite amusing and had made a joke that had the whole hall laughing out loud. And the three of them bounded down the many steps outside the main building and set off for a coffee at the Automatic before their next lecture. They were leaning into each other as they walked, heads together, conspiratorial, still laughing, with Anne-Marie in the middle. She always was, the center of things, the prettiest, with her dark curls that so elegantly framed her face and her slightly upturned nose. Denise and Marie-Josée were both plumper and plainer than she. Sometimes, in the grip of particular self-doubt, Denise wondered whether Anne-Marie had chosen them so as to look the prettiest. But the truth was that they all made each other laugh, and that was why they were close friends. They laughed so hard they fell off chairs, or coffee came out of their noses. And Marie-José had once confessed to Denise, though not significantly to Anne-Marie, that she laughed so hard that she wet her pants. Just a tiny bit, but still. Anyway, they were laughing as Anne-Marie told them about Léris, the handsome second-year Léris, with the soulful eyes and gaunt cheeks, always dapper in his trench coat with a cigarette drooping from his lip, hurrying into lectures late or out early as though he had more important places to be. But he'd come up behind her that morning when she was checking the notices on the bulletin board outside Boulot's class, and standing at her shoulder where she could barely see him out of the corner of her eye, so that when he spoke to her she was forced to turn, and there he was, his face so close to hers she couldn't help but stare at him, his long curled eyelashes and those sad eyes like an Italian film star, and he'd said, "Where did we meet?" Which was also like a line from an Italian film, because they'd never met. It was far more mundane than that, and he had to have known it. "Oh my God, he was flirting, such a flirt," squealed Marie-José, delighted, leaning in open-mouthed as if Anne-Marie's story were manna itself. And Denise was asking at the same time, speaking over Marie-José, "What did you say? What did you say?" But she never heard what Anne-Marie said, because she was thrown suddenly into the air. Her feet vanished beneath her, and she landed hard on her tailbone. She had trouble articulating the experience in words. All the feelings, the sensations were so vivid, the collapse of time, the confusion. She could say now that it was what she imagined it might be like to be attacked by a shark, a great, sudden, brute force devouring you. But in this case, of course, it was not a shark, but a car. And in the same fragmented moments in which she felt the guttering of her coccyx all the way up her spine, and then the grit of the sidewalk digging into her palms as she tried to right herself, but instead tilted onto her hands and knees and crawled like an animal toward the low stone wall along the pavement, in the petrol stink, a cloud of exhaust, while she heard Marie-José's squeals turn to screams, like a stuck pig. They would laugh only a few hours later. But in those first moments, with the combination of Marie-José's screams and Anne-Marie's eerie calm, Denise wondered if she'd been disfigured, or had lost a limb, or at least a finger, or what had happened, what had just happened. In all this intensity, these shards of thoughts and feelings, she saw the car pulling back off the sidewalk and continuing down the road as if nothing had happened. And in the passenger seat, the window down, her head turned back to gawp, amused, yes, amused. She could have sworn she saw that girl she knew. She knew her by sight, not just from the fact she'd seen her a few times around the university, but now she'd done her hair differently, but still, wasn't she so familiar, that girl from the lycée, that boarder in school? She never spoke, so shy and serious, a Berber girl from the provinces, pretty though and clever. What was her name? Was it even her? At first she could have sworn it was. She had the feeling the girl had been first amused, and then when she saw Denise's face, shocked, as though the whole thing had seemed a lark, funny even, and only when she recognized Denise had she been chastened. That was the story Denise compiled from the fragments later, that the man and the woman, the girl really, if it was in fact her classmate, Zora, yes, Zora, the name came back to her even as her certainty evaporated. Maybe it hadn't been her. Did it matter? Denise wouldn't report it either way, for all Marie-José said she ought to, she must. "No," Anne-Marie demurred, "an unfortunate accident, but you're fine, really. A moment's inattention on the driver's part. They were probably canoodling in the car, and then who'd seen enough even to pursue it. They'd been so shocked, all three of them." But here was the thing, she wrote to her brother. The car attacked her from behind like a shark. A blue deux chevaux, it mounted the curb and took a bite, as it were, and then slipped back into the ocean, back onto the road. But the car wasn't going fast. It could really have injured her, if it had been going fast, right? It was perfectly calibrated, the speed, the silence, the suddenness, as if the driver had planned the whole thing. Maybe a joke, maybe to terrify or terrorize her, if you'd rather, to make her afraid just to walk down the street laughing with her friends, to make her afraid to be. Why would someone do that to Denise, who wouldn't hurt a fly? Who was the driver? She had no idea. She'd seen only the back of his head, if even that, an impression of dark hair, but the girl, if it was Zora, well, she'd hauled herself onto the retaining wall while Anne-Marie picked up her handbag and her satchel, which hadn't been properly closed, and had spilled its contents even into the gutter. Denise had the sense of other students milling, murmuring, asking if she was okay. "C'est pas grave," she kept repeating, "ça va aller, c'est pas grave." And she meant it. She could see now that she had all her limbs and digits, and as far as she could tell, she wasn't even bleeding. Marie-José offered to run down the Rue Michelet and get her a coffee from the automatic. They'd been headed there anyway. And while she was gone, before Anne-Marie had gathered her books and pens and even the eraser, blue and pink, that had flipped into a puddle, when Denise sat alone on the wall with her tailbone aching, unsure yet how much it hurt, she started to shake everywhere. all over, her arms and legs and head and shoulders, uncontrollably like a dry leaf in a great storm, and she could do nothing about it. Anne-Marie, seeing this, rushed to her side and enveloped her, so sweet-smelling, those lovely black curls tickling her cheek, and she held her, you might say, quelled her, until Marie-José returned with the coffee, and the moment had definitively passed. She did not put this in the letter to François, what relief and security she had felt held in her friend's arms, although they weren't particularly strong arms, but said instead simply that she had trembled all over uncontrollably. And of course, the story would become properly a story a few years later when the troubles were fully underway, when Denise was no longer in Algiers, none of them were by then, François in Paris, and she at the hotel school in Lausanne, and Maman and Papa in Morocco, where the troubles found them anyway. But only then, after September 56, when Zora Drift bombed the milk bar, and a few months later, in late January 57, almost exactly 4 years after the de Chevaux knocked Denise off her feet, the bombing of the very automatic café to which Marie-José had run for her restorative coffee, and the automatic at the same time as the Coq Hardy and the cafeteria, killing in all 4 and injuring 50 in a single afternoon. Only once all these things had happened, like fatal flowers blooming, did Denise go on to insist that she had definitely seen Zora Drift in the de Chevaux that morning, that she had been deliberately attacked, the driver the opposite of inattentive, that it was an early salvo of the insurgency, and that she, Denise, was lucky to have escaped with only torn stockings and a constellation of bruises.